Hello, everybody. Welcome to Starfleet Tactical. I'm Chris Weave. I'm flying solo this week. Pat's wife is back from having been gone out of the country for a month. And so Pat, for some strange reason, decided that he'd rather have his first weekend home with his wife. He'd rather spend it with his wife rather than hanging out on YouTube with us. So I guess we know where we rank in Pat's hierarchy. Alec, of course, still has all the issues associated with not having internet. So, in fact, he did a live stream the other day. I think he was doing it on his phone, and it demonstrated really well why he doesn't do that on his phone if he can possibly avoid it. So we don't have Alec for tonight. So what we're going to do tonight, then, I've got a couple of presentations I can do, and I'm going to put it up for a very quick vote. So the two presentations are, I've got a presentation I've done for a while now called Aircraft Carriers in Space. I've talked about some of these issues before, but I don't think I've ever actually sort of done the full presentation on the show. So that's one possibility. The other one is for the Bu-9 annual meeting a couple of years ago, we designed a ship. It was originally sort of intended as a container ship in the Honorverse. But we never, it's not canon. It's something we pitched to David, and he decided he didn't want to do that. And so as a result of that, it's, we're just sort of doing our own thing with it. And so let me know which one you guys want, whether you'd rather see aircraft carriers in space or the container ship. I guess in some ways I'd kind of rather do the container ship, but I'll do the aircraft carriers in space if that's what you want. You're going to see them both eventually anyway. So so I'll just sit here and give Buddy some attention. He actually was pretty good today. He was asleep until just a little while ago, so he actually let me work on the presentations. So so we got carriers, it looks like. Mr. Voigt. Okay, 2 for carriers. All right, so if there's anybody that really wants the container ship one, you got to talk about now. You got to sing out now. Okay, it's looking like it's carriers. Yep, all right, we're going to do carriers. Okay, so give me just a chance here to set it up. I got to find it. Okay, hold on a second. I'm failing PowerPoint 101. Let me close the other one and do that. And now I need to do this. Okay. Now I need to do this. Okay, and as soon as, all right, and I will hide that. And hey, Lissa, why don't you go ahead and dump my picture off? I don't think they need to see me. It'll make it a little bit bigger and easier for people to see. Perfect, thank you very much. Okay, so this is my aircraft carriers in space talk. It's part of something that I call the grammar of space warfare. There's 3 talks in this series so far. I intend for there to be more in the future, but I just haven't gotten there yet. Yes, yes. So, so here's sort of the outline of where I'm going to go with this. It's a very simple talk. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction. Then I'm going to do some examples from science fiction of different carrier-like vessels in science fiction. Then I'll go back and I'll talk about real-world aircraft carriers and what makes real-world aircraft carriers special. And then I'll talk about some implications for science fiction of that real-world stuff. But first of all, this is the USS Carl Vinson. In some versions of the talk, I don't tell you the little bit there, but the original call sign of the Carl Vinson was Battlestar, because Carl Vinson came out in 1980. That's when that ship entered the fleet, and they called it the Battlestar. Now, by the time I went on Carl Vinson, the first time was in 2000, I think, or 2001. 2001. By the time I went aboard Carl Vinson, her call sign was Golden Eagle, but it used to be called Battlestar, and I've never figured out exactly when that switch happened. Sometime. Okay, so this talk is not the opinion of anybody but me, because of course, as you all know, these are the opinions of me. They're not the opinions of any employer, past, present, or future, presumably. They are my own opinions only. This isn't really a comprehensive discussion of this topic because I've got about an hour and it would take about 10. I'm not going to argue in favor of the right way to do things. I might point out sort of how I think about things, but it isn't about whether it's right or wrong. And let me emphasize this last point. Nothing I say about any of this should prevent you from enjoying any work of science fiction. I'm not here to rain on anybody's parade and tell you that, oh, you shouldn't like that because it's problematic. I can tell you how aircraft carriers work and what I think are the implications of that as applied to science fiction. But, you know, those of you who were here at the very, very beginning, Alec and I had a 90-minute conversation about Warhammer 40K. There's not a damn thing in the entire universe that makes the least amount of sense. So, you know, if I can like Warhammer 40K, I'm certainly okay with you guys liking whatever you like. So what I do think that this is, though, is that this is an opportunity to pass along information that I think might be interesting. So let me know if you think it's interesting. And I also kind of view this as being the beginning of a discussion about how to think and talk about naval warfare in science fiction. And naval's in quotes there because, you know, naval technically means about the ocean. I really like this illustration, by the way. These are all to scale. So that's a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, the space battleship Yamato, and the Battlestar Galactica from the new series. So if you look at those flight pods, each one of those flight pods is easily twice the volume. Each flight deck in that flight pod is twice the size of the flight deck of a Nimitz class. And I would argue that overall it's way more than twice the volume. So Battlestars are huge. So here's my conclusion up front. Naval platforms are defined by the media in which they operate, in the real world, that is, right? So if you operate on the sea or in the sea, you can have large capacity, you can have long endurance, but the penalty you pay for that is relatively low speed. If you operate in the air, in the sky, if you're an aircraft, you have relatively small capacity, you have short endurance, but your speed can be a lot higher. So we have aircraft carriers as a way to use these differences to our advantage. So, and a flight deck is a mechanism to do that. A flight deck is basically a door between the sea and the sky. It lets us take airplanes to sea, but then put them into the sky when we need to. There are implications of all of this, most of which are ignored whenever somebody takes the aircraft carrier model and sort of turns it into a science fiction model, right? You basically ignore most of the things that are the reasons why it works in the real world. That doesn't mean that aircraft carriers in space aren't cool. I think they're really cool. I think this model here is really cool. That's a nifty idea. And one of the things I like about it is that you look at it and you immediately go, I know what that thing is supposed to be. Does it make any sense? Probably not. Not so much. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples from science fiction. I'm going to look at pure carriers. I'm going to look at hybrid carrier battleships. And then I'm going to look at torpedo boat carriers. So now let me foot stomp once again. Nothing I say should prevent you from enjoying any of these, right? Some make more sense than others in terms of like when I'm putting on my analytic hat, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't enjoy any of them. So pure carriers, Battlestar Galactica is a pretty good example of pure carriers, right? They operate exactly like aircraft carriers do. They have large flight pods that function as flight decks. You carry relatively small craft that are 1 or 2 man or maybe just a few more. And especially in the old show, it seemed that most of the weapons they had were basically World War II equivalent type weapons, you know, pew, 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 pew. I've always thought that the way it really sort of looked like in the old Battlestar Galactica is that it's like World War II in the Pacific, but nobody had anything bigger than a 50 caliber gun or a 20 millimeter cannon, and so you're sinking battleship equivalents with 20 millimeter cannons. But it's still pretty cool. I like the newer version a little bit better because it adds the idea that there are other spacecraft on board this carrier that have a military role. Specifically the command and control / ECM / AWACS type vessel in the lower right-hand corner. So I really like the idea that they added something else to that mix. That seemed to me to be a very good deal. But this is basically a pure carrier type model. I'll note, though, it doesn't follow the rest of the model that we see from the real world, which is that carriers don't go and operate by themselves. They always have escorts to provide them with extra air defense, etc. Carriers are really, really optimized for the placement, the care and feeding and launch and recovery of aircraft in the real world and in Battlestar Galactica spacecraft. That's really what they're best at in the real world, and as a result, we have other ships along to perform other functions, but they just don't do that in Battlestar Galactica. Okay, you can make the argument the fleet got blown up, but you don't see very many examples in the new show of other types of ships, and I don't recall seeing any examples in the old show of other types of ships. So sort of wonder, like, why did they set things up that way? All right, so now let's take a look at what I call hybrid carriers. Stargate and Babylon 5, where you've got things that are really designed to function as battleships, but then they also carry a small number of craft. I think in a lot of ways this makes more sense for a science fiction universe. I'll talk about why when I get there. This is not a model that's very popular in the real world, and that's because in the real world, you really need to optimize on the task of the care and feeding of airplanes. And as a result of that, basically, the mission statements of what you're trying to do with a battleship and what you're trying to do with an aircraft carrier are about as far apart as you can get and still be in the same galaxy. So it doesn't work when you're talking about surface forces. So there's another model that I actually kind of like, and I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end, and that's the torpedo boat carrier option. This is from Scott Geyer's Ganellan series. Scott had 3 books come out under Del Rey, and he got caught in the midlist purge, and so they dropped the series, and then the 4th book was published by Sci-Fi Arizona, which is Michael McCollum's shop. Michael McCollum is he's probably retired by now, but he was an engineer at Allied Signal in Arizona, and he was a midlist author for Del Rey. And when he got dropped from Del Rey, he basically said, you know what, I'm going to experiment with online publishing, etc. And he was the first person I know of that did online publishing. And he literally was like I ordered some Dead Tree edition books from him, and he said, yeah, I'll go to Kinko's and print them out, and I'll get them to you like tomorrow. It's like, okay. And I actually take credit for Scott Geyer's last book getting published because I found out about Sci-Fi Arizona. I contacted Scott Geyer. I told him about it. I put the 2 of them in touch, and he published that last book through Sci-Fi Arizona. But what we're looking at here, the ring-shaped ship is a mothership. It's basically a carrier. It has an FTL drive. The ship that we're seeing in front is a Corvette. It does not have an FTL drive. It does have its own carried craft, and it has a crew of, I want to say it's around 15. So you can, if in traveler terms, you can think of it as being a Ryder. In Honor Harrington terms, you can think of it as being a light attack craft, although I believe it's smaller than a LAC. In fact, it's definitely smaller than a LAC. And so they're the main offensive punch, but they don't have an FTL drive. This series is really, really good. I really enjoy it. So speaking of Honor Harrington, there we've got the LACs and the LAC carriers. I'll note that a LAC is not a fighter. Sometimes it gets described as being a fighter, but what we're talking about there is a 20,000-ton vessel. That is bigger than an Arleigh Burke class destroyer. It's bigger than a Zumwalt class destroyer. That is a large ship. It's only got a crew of 20, but it's still a big ship. And so light attack craft aren't used like fighters. They don't have a mission like fighters. They aren't crewed like fighters, etc., etc. But they are, and so they're much closer, I would argue, to being a torpedo boat. Okay, finally, for hybrid. Oh, did I leave one out? I think I left one out. Oh no, I'm sorry. I didn't. I sort of described this as being a hybrid torpedo boat carrier, in that this thing is really CJ Cherry calls these carriers, and they carry only a couple of these torpedo boat equivalents, which she calls riders. But it's also intended to be a battleship type vessel, plus they carry about 1,000 troops. So they're really, when she says carrier, they carry guns, they carry troops, they carry riders, they carry everything. So that's there's a couple of places in her universe where she uses the naval terminology. She talks about carriers, they have naval ranks, etc. But the rest of that universe is really sui generis. The rest of it just really doesn't follow any sort of terrestrial analog. A lot of the things that we see are terrestrial models with the serial numbers filed off. And I really can't say that about CJ Cherry's Alliance Union universe. It really sort of is its own thing. Hellburner, by the way, is the book that talks about the creation of the writers. It's the acquisition program for the writers, the test and evaluation program for it. First time I read the book, I thought it was okay. Second time I read it, I decided it was utterly fantastic. And the reason why it's utterly fantastic is that she really understands all the limitations on how acquisition programs work, which I became more in tune with, and then I later worked in that business for a while. And so, like, at one point, one of the characters has a conversation with a Senate committee that had come to see why there were so many problems. And the response is, look, you guys gave us this old crappy space station that's falling apart. It's 200 years old, and we're having to spend all of our development funds to do operations and maintenance. Okay, that's actually, that stuff like that happens in the real world. It's not really like Star Trek. So it's an utterly fantastic series, and I strongly recommend it. All right, so now let's talk about what real-world aircraft carriers do. So this is basically what I'm going to talk about. A few questions that I want you to think about for a while, and then I'm going to go through and talk about what makes a carrier, what different types of carrier aircraft are there, what different types of aircraft carriers, why they do what they do, and what are all the things they do and why do they do those things. And then finally, I'll just try to sum up what an aircraft carrier is, some rules of thumb about how to think about aircraft carriers that you can carry forward into thinking about science fiction. So here's a few questions to think about. What actually is an aircraft carrier? We've got lots of things out there that carry aircraft, but every Navy ship has a flight deck. A lot of them have hangars. Do you ever call those aircraft carriers? No, you don't. Some things look an awful lot like aircraft carriers, and we wouldn't call them an aircraft carrier, but other people do. Why is that? What does an aircraft carrier do and why? Because it does a lot of other things other than just the airplane part, and we'll talk about that. Why are aircraft carriers actually the way they are? And what are the implications of all this for science fiction? And I'm going to go through all this stuff, and hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll be able to answer all those questions. And once again, we have a picture of Carl Vinson. So first of all, a little history. And everybody who's been on this channel for a while has heard me do some version of this, so I'll do it relatively fast. Naval warfare fundamentally changes at the beginning of the 20th century, sort of from like 1890 to the early 20th century. There was this period there where you had all these different ships that did all these different things, and they had lots of different armament, and some of them had ram bows, and you had this and that and the other thing. And it was really sort of the Wild West for a while because they couldn't really figure out what worked. So they're just trying stuff, and technology's moving forward fast, and things are changing very quickly. And so let's try a little bit of everything and see what we get. But by the time that World War I rolls around, they've really kind of settled on a few things. You've got new weapons that have a ship-killing potential in a way that some other weapons didn't have. And so now you've got torpedoes and aerial bombs in addition to guns as ways that you can kill a ship. And theoretically, a torpedo or a bomb, if it's put in the right place, one of them might be able to take down a pretty good-sized ship. And same is true of shells, and if you're dropping these things on battleships, then maybe aerial bombs can't do it, but torpedoes might, and aerial bombs might be more effective than shooting shells if you can target them, if you can get in close with an airplane. So maybe you can do a better job with that stuff. You've now got aircraft to carry both torpedoes and aerial bombs, and then you've also got submarines that can shoot torpedoes and surface ships that can shoot torpedoes. And now you've also got aircraft carriers that can carry these aircraft. Now, did you have all that in World War I? No. World War I ships were airplanes were really, really limited in terms of what they could carry. It was really only in the 1930s that you had enough capability and capacity, enough capability in airplanes that it made sense to really sort of move your strategy in that direction. Yeah, you got these offhand things where old airplanes, usually British, were able to do some damage against ships, but they were always surprise attacks. They weren't like a battle, they were a mugging. And as a result of that, chances are they wouldn't have worked at anything that looked like a battle against a ship that was underway. But eventually you get to the point where you've got that capability. As aircraft capability evolved, the missions evolved along with it. So, early on, aircraft were really just there to spot gunfire and to do scouting. But by the time World War II rolls around, they're designed to actually drop weapons and do all sorts of other things. Specialization is really the order of the day. Hybrid aircraft carriers are generally a dead end because an aircraft carrier has to spend a lot of time chasing the wind. You want the wind coming straight over the flight deck to allow your planes to take off. So you have to be you're very sensitive to the wind. So whereas battleships really want to be organized in battle lines and maneuvering against enemy ships. So you've got maneuvering for the wind versus maneuvering against enemy ships. Battleships want to close with the enemy. They want to be within, 10,000 yards, 20,000 yards, whatever it is, based upon the time period, whereas aircraft carriers don't want to be anywhere near that stuff. Aircraft carriers are basically, Zippo lighters waiting to go off because they're filled with hundreds of thousands of gallons of aviation fuel. It's very, very dangerous to be anywhere near a shell. So you don't want to be anywhere near that stuff. So hybrid aircraft carriers just don't work in the real world. With real airplanes and real aircraft carriers, hybrids are a dead end. And also the aircraft threat required dedicated anti-air platforms. So you started seeing surface ships that were designed specifically to protect other ships, primarily but not exclusively aircraft carriers, from air threats. So it's worth talking about a few quick myths, trying to debunk a few quick myths. That Pearl Harbor was the demise of the battleship. Well, the Navy continued to consider the battleship as its primary striking arm for considerable time after Pearl Harbor. You can make the argument, you might point out, well, they stopped building battleships, and it's like, yeah, they won the battleship race. We had a battle line that was second to none. The Japanese couldn't build as fast as we did. They knew it, we knew it. Early on in the war, we didn't want to fight a battleship war because we'd lose, but later on, they didn't want to fight a battleship war because they would lose. And indeed they did when they came out and tried to fight us. So, even the battleships ton for ton took more damage than any other ship in the fleet. So battleships were more resistant to air attack than any other ships, and they still had tremendous striking power. What they didn't have is range. They were quite limited in terms of how far they could project that power. And so that's why aircraft carriers in the end won out. But you can make a really good argument that it was nuclear weapons that really made battleships obsolete, not aircraft carriers. The hidebound Navy refused to acknowledge the superiority of aircraft carriers. No, not really true. There were two different types of officers in the U.S. Navy. There were those that thought that aircraft carriers were had supplanted battleships, and there were those that thought that aircraft carriers were going to supplant battleships. The argument wasn't on what it was going to look like in, say, 1960. The argument was whether, are we there yet? And arguably, we got there about 1938, 1939. That's when you first started really having airplanes that could carry significant bomb loads, significant torpedo loads, significant distances. And that you started getting enough of those planes in enough numbers that it made sense to start thinking in terms of battleships as your primary offensive arm. So the Navy pretty much understood that aircraft carriers were going to be the way to go. It's just a question of when are we there yet? There's also the question about whether aircraft carriers won the war somehow. Well, there was an awful lot of battleships that got used. There was an awful lot of submarines that got used. Aircraft carriers certainly had an extremely important role to play, and they had a tendency to, they're glamorous. You've got guys with long scarves flying off, and they're very dramatic. I think it's a little bit much to just sort of put this in terms of aircraft carriers won the war. So let's talk about this. What I would argue are the salient features of an aircraft carrier. I would argue an aircraft carrier is a vessel that is built around the features that we see here. And those features are a flight deck, which functions as a doorway between the sea and the sky. It's a way from airplanes from getting from the ship into the sky and back again. It's also a place to park airplanes. You have to have some sort of method of launch. There's lots of different methods of launch depending upon the type of carrier you are and the type of airplane you are. But you have to have some specific way of getting the plane off the deck. Sometimes it's just the flight deck. In the old days, you didn't have catapults. You just had to get going fast enough that you could take off. That hasn't been the case for a really, really long time with anything except helicopters. You need some sort of method of recovery. These days, that means that you either have to have arrested recovery or you have to have vertical recovery. You need to have a hangar deck. Which is where you go to repair airplanes and to store them. Although in U.S. usage, we carry a lot more planes on our carriers because we view the flight deck as a perfectly good place to store an airplane. So basically, everybody else wants to put their stuff in the garage. We're willing to park in the driveway. And then you need a propulsion space to make this all work. And it has to be a pretty good size propulsion space because everything else leads to a very big ship, and you want this thing moving through the water fast. It's big, it needs to move fast. That means a big propulsion space. So when you build the aircraft carrier, when you build your ship, you focus on these characteristics when you're building it, I would argue that's what makes it an aircraft carrier. So let's compare a few aircraft carriers out there. So on the left, you have 4 different aircraft carriers. You have the Admiral Kuznetsov. That was the class of aircraft carrier we saw in the previous illustration. You've got a Nimitz class, the San Paulo, and the Charles de Gaulle. Now, you'll note that it doesn't really look like the Nimitz and the Kuznetsov are much different in size, but in terms of displacement, the Nimitz is almost twice the size. It's got a deeper draft. It's got more capability and capacity. It's just a bigger ship. Now, the data on the right-hand side is actually quite old by this point. That's probably a 10-year-old, maybe 12-year-old graphic. The list has changed a lot. But in the left two columns, you have all the aircraft carriers in the United States Navy. In the right column, you have everybody else combined. And so you'll note that that first column is really amphibs, which we would call amphibs, not aircraft carriers. But if you look at the U.S. amphibs and you compare it to, say, the Italian carriers or the Indian carrier, it's really hard to see what the difference is between those, right? They're bigger than the Thai carrier and the Spanish carrier, and they're bigger than one of the Italian carriers, but we don't call it a carrier, even though the rest of the world looks at it and says that it would be a carrier. But I really do need to go update this graphic because it's been a while and there's been a few changes in that list. So now let's talk about types of carrier aircraft real quick. So you've got a lot of different aircraft that may have a common airframe, but they use different mission loadouts when they're doing the different missions. So a good example of this is the F-18, which can function in an air-to-air mode. It can function in an attack mode. In a specialty version, it can function in electronic warfare. It can do tanker. It can do all those different roles. But those loadouts are different, and the loadouts make a difference in terms of getting off the deck of the aircraft carrier. The heavier the airplane, the harder it is to get it off the deck of the aircraft carrier. So some of these variants are inherently heavy, and some of them are just way more useful if they're fixed wing. Arguably, ASW is in some ways is more useful as fixed wing also, but having a helicopter that can dip a sonar in is pretty useful. So those heavy aircraft really need to have special capabilities to get off the network. You can trade off range for weight pretty much, with the exception, and there's exceptions to all the rules except that range to weight trade-off. There really just isn't any way around that. It's really hard to get a heavy airplane off, and the more stuff you carry, the less your range is going to be. So now let's look at types of aircraft carriers. So, and what the capability, what the implications for capability are. The bigger you are, you can do more things simultaneously, and you can have more catapults. So like you really need to be about 1,000 feet long to do simultaneous launch and recovery, and with up to 4 catapults. That basically describes a Nimitz. So a Nimitz can launch heavy aircraft. It can launch a lot of them relatively fast. You can do about one every 20 seconds or so, one every 15 seconds or so on average. So if you've got 80 airplanes, it still takes you 20 minutes to get them in the air, but you can get them in the air in 20 minutes. The smaller it gets, the less capable you are, and you start running into limitations. You really need to have catapults in order to operate heavy fixed-wing aircraft. You really can't do that without it. That's really kind of required. So like the British and their new carriers, they're kind of limited in what they can do. So we've talked a lot about airplanes and aircraft carriers. It's not surprising that something called an aircraft carrier is really all about airplanes, but it's not just about airplanes. So it is a floating airport, and it is all about airplanes: fly airplanes, house airplanes, fix airplanes, do all the airplane things. There's a lot of other things that take place on an aircraft carrier. It's a services facility for people and for ships. So you got a hospital, a dental clinic. There's multiple classrooms. It functions as a hotel because you can go and you can't book a room there, but I would come on board and I'd stay in the aircraft carrier, and sometimes you'd be on the aircraft carrier overnight because you were really trying to catch a plane someplace else to one of the other ships in the fleet, and you were waiting for a helicopter run to take you over there. There's machine shops and other electronics labs and stuff like that they don't have in the rest of the fleet. So sometimes it's like, we need a part, so we'll get it from the aircraft carrier. It functions as a logistics facility. You can get your mail, you can get food, there's spare parts, there's ordnance. It's got all these things, and you can transfer them between the aircraft carrier and other ships in the fleet. And it's a logistics hub. UPS flies into airports. You can, a ship needs a helicopter engine for one of its helicopters. It's going to come into the aircraft carrier, and then it's going to get brought over to the ship. And it's got a lot of extra space to function as a command and control node, because that's where the admiral and his staff are, the sea combat commander and his staff, the strike commander and his staff. You've got a lot of different extra people on there doing command and control type functions. So this, by the way, this slide is really where this talk originally came from, because when I was at the Center for Naval Analysis, I was thinking in terms of metaphors for what aircraft carriers are. Because after my first time out on an aircraft carrier, I realized aircraft carriers do all these other things. And from a science fiction standpoint, if you got rid of space-going aircraft carriers, right, if you didn't have the equivalent of that, you still have these other functions, some of which you'd really like to replicate, right? Be nice to have a hospital with the fleet, right? It's nice to have a logistics hub. It's nice to have a place where you can get fuel from and stuff like that. You got to have a place for all those command and control functions. And so you're going to have to replicate that someplace. Now, why is all that stuff on the aircraft carrier? In some cases, is sort of inherent to the function. It's a logistics hub because it's an airport. In other cases, though, we got the space. Remember that salient features of an aircraft carrier slide? In that, I talk about how, it's got to be big. You need to have a big flight deck. That flight deck has to be high up off the water to get out of all the turbulent air near the surface of the water. You have to move it through the water very quickly. And so when you add up it's got to be big, it's got to be tall, it's got to be moving fast. That means a big ship. Okay, so it's a big ship. And even after you put 80 airplanes and all the fuel they need and all the guys that are going to fix the airplanes and fly the airplanes and the ordnance that's going to go into the airplanes, even afterwards, you still got extra space. Now, I don't mean to make it sound like it's this luxurious, cathedral ceilings like the bridge of the Enterprise. It's still a ship at sea. It's still pretty crowded. But relatively speaking, there's a lot of space around there. And so there's places where you can put the admiral, the sea combat commander, and all those other services and classrooms and stuff like that. It makes sense. You've got the space, you put it all there, right? In the old days, you put all that stuff in the battleship. Nowadays, you put it all in the aircraft carrier. So it's useful to think about an aircraft carrier as not just being an airport, but it's also all these other things. So I've already mostly answered the next slide about why aircraft carriers do all these other things. It's a floating airport, so it's a transport hub. So that's why it explains all the logistics stuff. But as I said, the size of the aircraft carrier is really driven by the needs of that airport. And since you have the size, you might as well use it. So this is a rare picture of the Admiral Kuznetsov, where it's not like billowing black smoke and you can't see the tug that they always send out with it to drag it along wherever it goes. Because it inevitably breaks down because it's really it wasn't a very good aircraft carrier, and then the Russians just let it sit and rot for 20 years, and then they decided to go ahead and use it. But the last I heard, it was still being repaired because it was in a dry dock, and a crane fell on it and bashed a big hole in the flight deck. And to the best of my knowledge, they're not even trying to fix it. So we'll see what ends up happening with it. So here are the rules of thumb that I think you can sort of take away from all of this. And this actually really sort of comes from a little essay that was, I can't even remember the name of it, but it was written by John Layman. Well, the name on the cover was John Layman. I believe it was actually Norman Polmar that wrote it. But the rules of thumb are that any increase in capability is going to drive you towards a bigger ship. So more aircraft drives you toward a bigger ship. Greater payload means bigger airplanes, which means bigger ship. Arrested recovery and catapults mean bigger ship. Bigger ship means bigger. You can carry a lot bigger airplanes. Some missions are best performed by bigger airplanes, so you want to have the bigger airplanes. And if you want to have more of those missions able to be done simultaneously, you need to have more aircraft. So everything really sort of drives you towards a bigger ship. And vertical takeoff capability costs. There's no such thing as a free launch. Even if assuming the design of aircraft doesn't involve performance compromises, which is really a big assumption, you spend a lot of fuel to take off vertically, and it restricts what you can bring back on board afterwards. So, so you can find yourself in a situation where, if you're trying to do a short takeoff but vertical landing STOVL, that vertical landing piece of it means you might have to drop a very expensive missile in the ocean if you don't use it. In fact, the Brits in their new aircraft carrier with the F-35, they had to develop a new way of landing, which is rolling vertical landings, which means that they're not coming straight down. The ship's actually going at a pretty good clip, so they've still got wind over the deck, and as a result, when the airplane is able to come in and land slower, so it's like it's still doing this vertical landing stuff, but it's also got airflow going over the wings, so it's able to get more lift. And that was entirely because they had bring-back concerns. They were afraid of having to drop very expensive ordnance in the water without using it. A large aircraft carrier is generally more efficient than a small aircraft carrier. It's easier to move planes around on deck. It's easier to maintain stuff. It's just easier all the way around. Now, the things that are in red here are directly the result of that transfer between media function of that flight deck. That's really, that doorway between the sea and the sky function. So that's really, those are the things that if you put it into space, maybe you don't have those restrictions. Maybe those parts of the rules of thumb don't apply anymore if you take it and you turn it into a spacecraft. Okay, maybe. So what are some implications for science fiction? Let's, first of all, we'll take another look at the bottom line up front. Pretty much what I said before, naval platforms defined by the media in which they operate. You can either have, ships can have large capacity, long endurance, but low speed. Aircraft, small capacity, short endurance, but they get high speed in return for that. Carriers are a way to allow us to have our cake and eat it too. And, most of those examples I gave previously at the very beginning, they have a tendency to kind of ignore those differences, the ones that look like pure carriers. Implications for space-going fighters. When I look at it, I don't see a good excuse as to why something that looks like a traditional fighter makes sense. They don't have much endurance. They may or may not have ship-killing weapons. It really kind of depends upon the universe. Like, okay, nuclear weapons give you a lot of ship-killing capability, but if you've got shields of some sort, maybe you don't. I always think that something that looks like a torpedo boat carrier may be a better model, because torpedo boats, I think, make more sense than fighters. And what we have here is an actual picture of a torpedo boat carrier. This was a light cruiser that the French converted over to be a torpedo boat carrier circa 1890 something, 1905-ish, something like that. I forget exactly when. They later turned it into a seaplane carrier. Now, the problem with torpedo boats on surface navies is that torpedo boats don't make as much sense on Earth as they would in space, and that's because they're very susceptible to the weather, right? They don't handle wave action very well. They don't have very good endurance. They can be fast for short distances, but as a general rule, big ships are more stable. They handle weather better, and a long ship is inherently a faster ship. So long ships are inherently more efficient than small ships are. And so, torpedo boats are sort of a specialty thing. They're really good in archipelagos. They're really good as coastal defense stuff if you've got lots of sheltered waters that you can hang out in. They don't really work in the open ocean. But this was an idea about maybe we could use them in the open ocean. And it wasn't just the French. John Fisher, Jackie Fisher, the creator of the battle cruiser, at one point speculated in a letter about the idea of battle cruisers that would deploy torpedo boats before battle. Makes a lot more sense in space than it does on Earth. So what are the implications for space-going aircraft carriers? Well, as I've sort of pounded the table about this, aircraft carriers are fundamentally defined by their flight deck. They're not really good aircraft carriers if they're not defined by their flight deck. So if you don't need the flight deck, hybrids actually start looking much better. If you don't have to chase the wind, if you can just launch a fighter or whatever it is by pushing it out the door and it drifts away and you don't have to have the big flight deck, then maybe the right answer is not to put all your eggs in the high value unit basket. Maybe the answer is, the equivalent in a surface ship would be, rather than you put all your planes on the aircraft carrier, you put 5 planes here, 5 planes there, and you build ships that are 10,000 tons instead of 7,000 tons, and everybody carries a few ships, and if you lose one, it's not as bad as losing an aircraft carrier, and you've got a lot more flexibility. Now, you may have some issues with critical mass, and you might have some issues with you really want to. There's certain gear that you might have some engine test equipment that you really only want to pay for one. You don't have room to put it everywhere. So there's some other economics of scale issues that really matter in trying to figure out whether this makes sense or not. But it's a different set of questions. And you really have to go and question those assumptions. Go and take a look at it and see if it makes sense. This is just an image I pulled off the internet because I was looking for a good hybrid aircraft carrier option. I really should go find one of the battleship conversions. I think this was theoretically an Iowa battleship conversion, even though it doesn't really look like an Iowa. But there were some proposals to convert the Iowas into hybrid carriers, but they sort of fell apart because they were going to fly Harriers. They sort of fell apart because when you sort of looked at it, it's like, yeah, do I really want that much aviation gas just hanging out on my ship, right? The thing about a battleship is that a battleship is very tough and can take a lot of damage. Aircraft carriers are significantly less so because they have to carry so much fuel because planes are inherently very, very thirsty. So one last slide, a bonus slide. Let's talk about flying aircraft carriers for just a moment. We actually had flying aircraft carriers at one point. We experimented with dirigibles that could carry airplanes. It's hard to it's relatively easy to launch them. It's kind of harder to get them back on board. Never really could make this work as is. It was a nifty idea. It's seriously cool. But in the real world, you got some real weight limitations. You've got some real vulnerabilities. It's really hard for me to conclude that you're better off putting this thing in the sky where everybody can see it. You can carry so much more if you're floating on the water than if you're floating on air, right? Because this basically it turns your aircraft carrier into an air vehicle with the limitations of being an air vehicle. So even if you could do it, I'm not sure that you would want to. But I didn't say it isn't cool. It's really cool. So presumably people have been trying to give questions, and I basically have been busy talking, so I haven't been able to really look for questions. So give me just a moment here, and I will try to look through and see if there's any interesting questions that I can answer real quick. I'm sorry if I don't get back to you. I am going to try to go through and go through the questions that were put into the YouTube version of it. And I always try to post them later on. I'm actually a couple of weeks behind, but I try to go through the transcripts, try to go through the chat logs and do that. I just am behind on that. That's Loki made a good comment about maybe you counter torpedo boats with fighters. Yeah, I could believe that. I'm sort of doing this backwards. Okay. Yeah, Jeff Nelson points out that early on, Nimitz had a fuel bottleneck in the Pacific. He chose carriers and kept the remaining battle line on the West Coast. Yeah, there's battleships use an awful lot of fuel because they're big, heavy things, and they use a lot of fuel, and there wasn't really enough to go around. There wasn't enough tanker capability to go around. So a guy by the name of Fukia, Donald Fukia, Fuqua, if I remember correctly, wrote an article called The Wasting Assets of the Pacific, if I remember correctly, that talked about this exact issue and went into the rationale as to why, even when they started getting fuel, they didn't immediately start sorting with the battleships. And part of it is you got to kind of wait until you get a critical mass of them. And part of it was, like, let's wait until we build a few more, and then we'll use them. So let's see, going through here. Weather officer on an aircraft carrier near the battle. Yeah, kind of makes sense to me. Funny how we have larger carriers now, but smaller aircraft from the older days. No Vigilantes, no A3s, no S3s. Yeah, that's true. Although the F-18, if you go back to one of the earlier episodes, when Alex still had internet, we did the comparison. The F-18 is about the size of an F-14. It takes up the same amount of deck space. So not as big as the Vigilantes, not as big as the Whales, but still pretty good size airplane. Yeah, somebody had pointed, Kuznetsov also had fire damage. Yeah, Kuznetsov just not a good one. Yeah, I'd say Daedalus and Odyssey from Stargate SG-1, I'd consider them hybrid carriers. They've got the big flight pods. That's a universe where it's like, okay, I kind of get why you got fighters, kind of maybe why you got fighters out there doing stuff, but I can't help think, do I want this flight pod with a lot of fighters, or do I want to take that equivalent amount of mass and just put more big guns, more generating capability, more big guns, or maybe make the ship faster by not having the mass there? So general rule, I probably want more big guns in that way, because airplanes in the real world give you a real range advantage, right? You can go long distances. We don't see anything that looks like a range advantage in like Babylon 5 or SG-1, or even maybe a little bit in the new Battlestar Galactica. I guess in the old one too. You kind of got the range advantage there, but all these other ones, they use them when they're sort of fighting this melee battle up close. And so I guess, okay, they kind of did it at like they're self-escorting. They carry their own escorts, but there's a lot of times where I just think, I just would prefer to have more guns. It'd probably work better. Let's see. I'm going back here. Yeah, F-18s were an interesting story. Scott talks about the F-18 was a trade-off on mission capability. One of the things about the F-18 is that the YF-17 had a fuel fraction of 0.17. And so, which is normal for a test aircraft. So the mass of the aircraft that was used for fuel is 0.17 of a fully loaded airplane. That's really low for a production fighter. And when they went to the F-18, they didn't increase it at all. And so you could kind of make the argument that what they really should have built from the very beginning was the EF type model that had a bigger fuel fraction. So. But as I made the observation once before, the F-18, the YF-17 came out of the lightweight fighter competition, which is also where the F-16 came out of. That competition was so successful that they built both of the airplanes. They built the loser also. They didn't just build the winner, they also bought the loser. Yeah, I agree with Chandler. I think it's, if you had to say that there was a particular ship class that won the war, submarines are a good one also. Yeah, Norman Friedman's comment about engine development pushing carrier to dominance because it let the fighters fight land-based airplanes on an even footing. That makes a lot of sense to me. One thing that I haven't seen discussed yet, in terms of with the Japanese and the Pacific, but I know about this from discussions about against the Germans, is that our fuel was way better than the Germans, and we were sending fuel to the Brits. In fact, the head of fighter command is on record as saying that the reason why they won the Battle of Britain was that they were fighting over their own territory. So when they get the pilot back afterwards, and that they had highly skilled pilots, the Merlin engine in the Spitfire was just a fantastic engine, and that they had high quality, high octane, low contaminant fuel. And so our fuel octane was way higher than the Germans, and so as a result, we got way better performance. I have to think that statement's probably true for us versus the Japanese also. I've never actually seen that, though. But John Parshall points out I can't remember if it's in the book Shattered Sword, or he just pointed it out in a discussion that I had with him. But John points out that the Japanese had a consistent range advantage with their airplanes over ours of about 100 to 150 miles, if I remember correctly. Maybe it was more like 200. And they never appeared to be aware of it, and were never able to capitalize on it. Now, my response to that is I'm not sure how you would capitalize on it, because so much of that, the critical factor in all of that is really your scouting capability. And so the farther out you go, the bigger the circle gets, the more area you have to cover, the more scouting assets you need to do that. So I think you find yourself in a situation where you just can't cover the territory necessary to take advantage of the fact that you can hit them at a longer range. It might be that the right answer, if you discover the enemy, the right answer is for them would be to turn and walk away, right? Open the distance, don't close the distance any further. But I don't think there was really that many situations where they found us first like that. So, but that I cannot pretend that I've done any meaningful study on that at all. Let's see. We've got just a couple of minutes left. My dear brother Delon makes the observation that I am talkative regardless of the situation. I'll plead guilty to that. Yeah, Delon's comment, I make it a lot more interesting than he ever could, even when I've heard it a few times before. Yeah, Delon's heard a lot of these stories before. Because this isn't the first time I've done this presentation. And one of the places where I've done this presentation before is at DemiCon, which is a science fiction convention in Des Moines that Delon sometimes go to. So my brother Sean always goes to DemiCon, and I always go to DemiCon now because it's the opportunity to hang out with Sean for the weekend, and Delon when he's available and can come to the con. So, sometimes I do presentations while I'm there, sometimes I don't. Okay. Okay. So Rob, last question, I think, is Rob Davidoff says, any thoughts I can share about the large unmanned surface vessel and how they might work with the fleet? Sounds nifty, but high boondoggle chance. Don't have any particular thoughts on the various drone ships and stuff the Navy has done in terms of like, what the Navy's planning on doing with them. But, they did this demonstrator, this DARPA demonstrator thing. And the idea behind that was that you could give a ship that had an active sonar system on it. And you could have it basically be a robo ship, and it could run around and track enemy submarines. And so it was really intended as a localization and tracking asset, not a detection asset. So detection is generally big field of view, especially when we're talking about ASW stuff. Big field of view. Oh, I think that there's something over there. I need to go over and try to find that thing that's over there. And then once you find it, you try to stay on top of it and you try to localize it down. Because the narrower that you can get it, you can eventually get it to the point where I know where it is well enough to drop a weapon on it, right? It's sort of the difference between looking through the scope of a rifle and somebody sort of cueing you and saying, yeah, it's over there in the trees. It's like, okay, yeah, I know it's over there in the trees. He can even tell me which tree it's at, but I'm not going to be able to hit it unless I can actually see it with my weapon. So the drone ship that DARPA came up with was really sort of designed for a situation where you found a submarine and you want to keep track of it. So what you do is you set this watchdog on it, and it just sort of pings the shit out of it and makes their life miserable and just follows it around. It'd be interesting to have a lot of those in the fleet. And if you could have enough of those, and so that you could sort of rotate them in and out, because if they've only got usually aircraft carrier strike groups have to do underway replenishments every couple, like twice a week. Now, a large chunk of that is you want to stay topped off in case you don't have the opportunity to replenish because you're doing some op. Airplanes are really, really thirsty. They use lots of fuel, but surface ships use lots of fuel too when they're trying to keep up with aircraft carriers. And so you're going to have to refuel these things every now and then. And so you're going to have enough of them operationally to sort of, do trade-offs, right? So in a lot of ways, it's actually fulfilling a lot of the same role that the helicopter fills, not the same role that the destroyers fill. It's basically, in fact, you can kind of think of it, it's their way of trying to have their cake and eat it too also. They're trying to get the endurance of a ship, but give it the mission of a helicopter. So I look forward to seeing what the Navy does with it. Kind of wish I was still in the Navy business so I could be a little bit closer to that. So we're a little bit past our hour, so I think I'm going to call it here. As always, it's been a lot of fun. Hopefully Pat will be back next week. And thank you very much, everybody. And let's see, let me stop this. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you next week. As I was going through this, I saw all the different places where I had typos.
It happens.
It's distressing. It's happened on
the book list.
I'm sorry, what?
I said, you need to send me the book list.
Oh, I do.
Because I found out where the library is near me, and if they've got it, I will pick up those books.
Let me make a note. I haven't updated it in a while.
I know. But anyways, I'm going to head out.
Hello, Delon.
Hello.
My brother Delon just called me.
Well, good timing on my part then.
All right, I'll talk to you. Talk to you later, Lissa.
Bye, Chris.
Bye.